Some mornings, you know something's wrong before you even step out of your car. I'm Claire Hartwell, and I've been funeral director at Restwood Memorial for 18 years. I've seen grief take every shape imaginable: silence, bargaining, acceptance. But in all my years walking these grounds, I'd never seen anything like what started happening in Section K last month. It began on a Tuesday in late September. The California drought had been particularly harsh that year, turning our once green lawns into patches of stubborn brown grass that crunched underfoot. Water restrictions meant we could only irrigate the newer sections, leaving the older parts of the cemetery looking skeletal and forgotten. Section K, tucked away in the northwest corner behind a grove of dying eucalyptus trees, had been hit especially hard. I was making my usual morning rounds, checking for any overnight vandalism or maintenance issues, when I noticed them: white lilies. 6 perfect stems arranged in a small crystal vase on an unmarked patch of ground in row 15. The flowers looked fresh, petals still firm, stems green and supple, water droplets clinging to the leaves like morning dew. That should have been impossible. We hadn't had rain in 3 months. I knelt beside the arrangement, careful not to disturb it. The ground beneath was the same parched earth as everywhere else in Section K, cracked and hardpan. According to our records, this particular spot had been reserved but never used, purchased in 2008 by a woman named Margaret Thorne, who'd moved to Oregon before ever needing it. The plot had sat empty for 15 years. I assumed someone had made a mistake, perhaps confused about where their loved one was buried. It happens more often than you'd think. Grief can make familiar places feel foreign. I photographed the flowers and made a note to check with Margaret Thorne's family, then continued my rounds. The next morning, they were there again. Same spot, same white lilies, same crystal vase, same impossible dewdrops catching the early sunlight. I called Tommy, our head groundskeeper, to ask if he'd seen anyone in Section K. He hadn't. I checked the security footage from the cameras positioned at the section's entrance, but the infrared showed nothing unusual, just the usual parade of raccoons and the occasional coyote picking through the shadows. By Thursday, I was troubled enough to stay late and position myself where I could watch Section K through the night. I brought coffee and a folding chair, settling into the maintenance shed where I had a clear view of row 15. The moon was nearly full, casting long shadows between the headstones. Nothing happened. I dozed fitfully around 3 in the morning, startling awake when a barn owl called from the eucalyptus grove. Section K lay empty and still in the moonlight. When I walked over at dawn, the flowers were there again, fresh white lilies, in the same crystal vase, arranged with the same careful precision. That's when I noticed something else. The flowers weren't just fresh. They were identical, not similar identical. The same slight bend in the third stem, the same small chip in the vase's rim, the same arrangement of 6 blooms, with the tallest positioned at the back and the shortest in front. I started documenting everything: photographs from multiple angles, measurements. I even collected one of the flowers and pressed it between the pages of my planner, though I'm not sure what I expected to learn from a dried lily. The pattern continued for 2 weeks. Every morning, the same arrangement appeared on the empty plot. Every night, the security cameras showed nothing. I began arriving earlier, sometimes before 5 a.m., but the flowers were always there first, as if they'd been waiting for me in the darkness. Then Mrs. Chen from the flower shop on Maple Street called. "Claire, I've been meaning to ask who's been buying all those white lilies. Same person's been coming in every few days for the past month. Always pays cash, never says much. Just points to the lilies and asks for 6 stems." My mouth went dry. "Can you describe them?" "Well, that's the thing. I keep meaning to pay more attention, but it's like they slip my mind the moment they leave. I remember the cash on the counter. I remember arranging the lilies, but..." She paused. "It's probably nothing. Just getting old, I suppose." I drove to Chen's Flowers immediately. Mrs. Chen showed me her order book, where she'd been marking down the lily sales. 6 stems, every 3 days for the past month. But there was no name recorded, no description of the customer, just the notation, 6 white lilies, cash. Have you seen them recently? I asked. Mrs. Chen frowned, as if trying to recall something just out of reach. I think maybe yesterday? Or was it the day before? I'm sorry, Claire. I wish I could be more help. That evening, I decided to try a different approach. Instead of watching from the maintenance shed, I would spend the night in Section K itself. I brought a camping chair and positioned myself 3 rows away from the empty plot, hidden behind a large granite monument. If someone was placing those flowers, I would see them. The night was still and cold. The drought had killed most of the insects, leaving an unnatural silence broken only by the distant hum of traffic on Highway 101. I kept my eyes fixed on the unmarked grave, checking my watch every few minutes. Midnight passed. 1 a.m. 2. Around 3:30, I must have dozed off, because I woke to the sound of footsteps on dry grass. A figure was walking slowly through Section K, moving between the headstones with the careful deliberation of someone who knew exactly where they were going. In the moonlight, I could see they were carrying something, a small vase, perhaps, or a bouquet. I held my breath, afraid to move. The figure approached the empty plot and knelt down, placing their offering on the ground with gentle precision. They remained there for several minutes, head bowed, as if in prayer or conversation. When they stood, I caught a glimpse of their face in the moonlight. It was a woman, perhaps in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a loose bun. She wore a simple dark dress and moved with the careful grace of someone accustomed to visiting graves. She turned and walked away, retracing her steps through the monuments. I waited until she was well out of sight before approaching the plot. The white lilies were there, arranged in the crystal vase, exactly as they had been every morning for the past month. But now I noticed something I'd missed, before a small note tucked beneath the vase, written in careful cursive on cream-colored paper. For my darling David, I promised I'd visit every day. Love, Margaret. Margaret Thorne, the woman who'd purchased the plot, but moved to Oregon. I drove home in a daze, the note tucked carefully in my jacket pocket. The next morning, I called the number we had on file for Margaret Thorne. A man answered her son. Michael. My mother? He sounded confused. She's been dead for 6 months. Passed away in Portland last March. We had her cremated and scattered her ashes in the Columbia River, just like she wanted. I'm sorry for your loss, I managed. Can you tell me, did she ever mention someone named David? There was a long pause. David was my father. He died in a car accident in 2008. Mom bought that plot in California, thinking she'd be buried next to him, but Dad's remains were never recovered. The car went off a cliff into the ocean during a storm. Mom never got over it. I hung up and sat in my office for a long time, staring at the note. That afternoon, I drove back to Section K with a small shovel and carefully dug into the earth of the empty plot. 3 feet down, I found them fragments of bone, weathered smooth by salt water and time. And tangled among the remains, a tarnished wedding ring engraved with the words, "Forever yours, Margaret." I reburied everything and smoothed the earth back into place. The next morning, the white lilies were there as always, arranged with the same careful love. But now I understood what I was seeing, not an intrusion, but a completion. Margaret Thorne had finally found her way to the grave she'd been tending in her heart for 15 years. I've stopped checking the security cameras. I've stopped wondering how the flowers appear, or where the dew comes from in a drought. Some promises, I've learned, are stronger than death, stronger than distance, stronger than the simple logic of what should or shouldn't be possible. The white lilies still appear each morning in Section K, perfectly arranged, still wet with dew that shouldn't exist. And every time I see them, I remember Margaret Thorne's careful handwriting. I promised I'd visit every day. Some promises, it turns out, are meant to be kept forever. There's something wrong with the earth in Plot 47, and it's been calling to me for 3 weeks now. I'm Ramon Valdez, and I've been head groundskeeper at Hillcrest Memorial for 14 years. I know every inch of these 120-acre Severy slope that floods in winter, every tree that drops branches in high winds, every patch of soil that settles unevenly over time. Cemeteries are living things, always shifting, always requiring attention. But what's happening around the old Hendricks grave isn't natural settling. It started in early October, just after the first real rain of the season. I was making my morning rounds, checking for any storm damage from the night before, when I noticed my equipment had been moved. Not stolen, moved. The 3 shovels I'd left leaning against the maintenance shed were now standing upright in a perfect line near plot 47. Their blades buried 6 inches deep in the soggy earth like strange metal flowers. I figured it was kids. Halloween was coming, and teenagers sometimes thought cemetery pranks were funny. I pulled the shovels free and made a mental note to increase our security patrols around the older sections. The Hendricks plot was in a quiet corner of the cemetery, tucked beneath a massive oak tree that had been there since before the first burials in 1923. But the next morning, it happened again. This time, not just the shovels. My wheelbarrow had been flipped upside down and positioned exactly in the center of the grave plot, with the shovels arranged in a perfect triangle around it. The rake was standing upright beside the headstone, its metal tines gleaming with morning dew. I called the police, but Officer Martinez just shrugged when he saw the scene. Probably just kids, Ramon. You know how it is around Halloween. Maybe set up a trail camera if it keeps happening. That afternoon, I walked over to the cemetery office to check our records on the Hendricks burial. Eleanor Hendricks, interred May 15th, 1947. The file was thin, just the basic paperwork and a note that the casket had been reinforced with additional concrete due to the family's specific request. No details about why they'd wanted the extra weight, just a receipt showing they'd paid for the upgrade. The third morning, I arrived to find something that made my hands shake as I fumbled for my cell phone to take pictures. Every piece of equipment in our maintenance area, hovels, rakes, wheelbarrows, even the heavy lawnmower had been arranged in concentric circles around plot 47. The pattern was geometrically perfect, as if someone had used a compass and ruler in the dark. More disturbing was what I noticed about the grave itself. The ground was sinking. Not the gradual settling you'd expect from a 76-year-old burial, but a steady, noticeable depression that seemed to deepen each day. The bronze headstone, which had been level with the surrounding earth when I'd checked it the previous week, now tilted slightly forward, as if the ground beneath it was collapsing. I called the cemetery director, Mrs. Patterson, who drove out immediately. She stood at the edge of the plot, frowning at the arranged equipment and the sinking earth. "Have you seen anything like this before?" I asked. She shook her head slowly. "In 30 years, I've never. Ramon, I want you to rope off this area. No visitors, no maintenance work. I'm going to call the county inspector." That evening, I stayed late to install the rope barriers around plot 47. The sun was setting behind the oak tree, casting long shadows across the headstone. As I worked, I noticed something carved into the base of Eleanor Hendricks' monument letters, so weathered they were barely visible. "She walks deeper." I ran my finger over the carved words, feeling the rough granite. They weren't part of the original inscription. Someone had added them later, using crude tools that had left jagged edges in the stone. The county inspector arrived the next morning with ground-penetrating radar equipment. I watched from a distance as he set up his instruments and began scanning the area around plot 47. After an hour, he called Mrs. Patterson over and showed her something on his small screen. "There's definitely a void down there," he said, pointing to a dark space on the display. "Looks like the casket has dropped into some kind of cavity. Could be an old sinkhole, or maybe the concrete pad failed." "Is it safe?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "For now, but I'd recommend excavation to see what's happening. That depression's going to keep growing until whatever's down there stabilizes." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the carved words on the headstone. "She walks deeper," and the way the ground seemed to be pulling everything down into itself. Around midnight, I gave up trying to rest and drove back to the cemetery. The grounds were empty, lit only by the scattered security lights along the main paths. I parked near the maintenance shed and grabbed a flashlight, intending to check the rope barriers around plot 47. But as I approached the Hendricks grave, I saw something that made my blood turn cold. The wheelbarrow was back, not just move-buried. Only the handles were visible above ground, sticking up from the earth like metal arms reaching for help. The shovels were planted around it in the same triangle pattern, but now they were buried deeper, only their wooden handles showing. I pulled out my phone to call the police, but the screen showed no signal. That was impossible. I'd gotten 5 bars from this exact spot earlier in the day. I tried again, holding the phone higher, but the display remained blank. A soft sound made me turn toward the headstone. It was a gentle scraping, like fingernails on wood. The sound was coming from beneath the ground. I knelt beside the grave, pressing my ear to the cold earth. The scraping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. It was followed by a softer sound of rustling, like fabric moving in a confined space. The ground beneath my hands was warm. I jerked back, aiming my flashlight at the depression around the headstone. The earth was moving slightly, rising and falling in a gentle rhythm, not settling breathing. The carved words on the monument seemed to glow in the flashlight beam. She walks deeper. I understood then what was happening. Eleanor Hendricks wasn't resting in peace. She was digging. Each night, she worked her way deeper into the earth, and somehow, the cemetery equipment was being drawn down with her, pulled by whatever force was creating the expanding void beneath Plot 47. I backed away from the grave, my flashlight beam wavering. The scraping sound grew louder, more urgent. Then, just as I reached the rope barrier, it stopped. The silence was absolute. No wind in the oak tree, no distant traffic. Even the usual night sounds of the cemetery rustle of small animals, the settling of old monument shad ceased. I ran to my truck and drove home without looking back. The next morning, I found Plot 47 empty. Not just the equipment, everything. The headstone was gone, the oak tree had vanished, and where the grave had been, there was now a perfectly circular depression in the earth, about 12 feet across and impossibly deep. Mrs. Patterson called the county inspector, who brought a team of engineers. They lowered a weighted line into the hole and ran out of cable at 200 feet without hitting bottom. The walls of the depression were smooth, as if polished by countless hands sliding downward. That was 6 months ago. The hole has been filled with concrete and steel, then covered with fresh soil and replanted with grass. There's a small plaque now where Eleanor Hendricks' headstone used to be, reading simply, "Unknown Depth." But I know what's down there. Sometimes, late at night when I'm locking up the maintenance shed, I can hear the scraping again. Fainter now, but still present. She's still walking deeper, still pulling the earth down with her, still making room for whatever else wants to follow. I've started leaving my equipment in the office building instead of the shed. Some things, I've learned, are better left on solid ground. The dead don't speak, but sometimes they forget that rule. I'm Jude Carpenter, and I've been a licensed embalmer at Riverside Funeral Home for 11 years. In that time, I've prepared over 3,000 bodies for their final rest. I know the science of preservation, the art of restoration, and the delicate balance required to give families one last peaceful moment with their loved ones. But what happened during Mrs. Delacroix's viewing taught me that some people carry conversations beyond the grave. Evangeline Delacroix arrived at our facility on a Tuesday morning in November, transported from Mercy General, where she'd passed quietly in her sleep at age 84. Her daughter, Marie, had requested a 3-day viewing followed by burial at St. Catherine Cemetery. It was a standard arrangement, nothing unusual about the paperwork or the family's requests. Mrs. Delacroix had been a small woman in life, barely 5 feet tall, with silver hair that her daughter insisted be styled in the same soft wave she'd worn for 60 years. Her face held the peaceful expression that often comes with natural death: no pain, no struggle, just the gentle release of someone who'd lived a full life and was ready for whatever comes next. I began the embalming process that afternoon, following the same careful procedures I'd performed thousands of times before. Arterial embalming, cavity treatment, cosmetic restoration. Mrs. Delacroix responded well to the process. Her skin tone remained natural. Her features relaxed into a serene expression that would comfort her family during their grief. The viewing was scheduled to begin Thursday evening, with visitation hours from 6 to 9. I positioned Mrs. Delacroix in the Magnolia Room, our smallest and most intimate space, surrounded by the arrangements of white lilies and yellow roses that Marie had specifically requested. Everything was perfecter should have been. The first sign of trouble came Thursday night, about an hour into the viewing. I was greeting visitors in the main hallway when Marie approached me, her face creased with concern. "Jude, could you take a look at Mama? Her mouth seems to have opened." I followed Marie back to the Magnolia Room, where a small group of family members stood around the casket. Mrs. Delacroix's mouth had indeed fallen open, creating a gap between her lips that gave her face a completely different expression. Not peaceful, but urgent, as if she were trying to speak. "I'm sorry about this," I told Marie, gently adjusting Mrs. Delacroix's jaw back to its proper position. "Sometimes the muscles relax more than expected. It won't happen again." But it did happen again. Twice more that evening, I had to return to the Magnolia Room to readjust Mrs. Delacroix's mouth. Each time, the gap was slightly wider, as if whatever she was trying to say was becoming more insistent. That night, after the last visitors had left, I wheeled Mrs. Delacroix back to the preparation room for what should have been a routine overnight storage. Instead, I decided to take additional measures. I carefully inserted a small support structure to keep her jaw in place, securing it with medical-grade wire that would be invisible to visitors but would prevent any further movement. Friday's viewing proceeded normally until late afternoon, when I noticed Mrs. Delacroix's mouth had opened again. This should have been impossible. The support structure was still in place, undisturbed. Yet somehow, her jaw had moved enough to create that same urgent gap between her lips. I called Dr. Hernandez, the pathologist who'd signed Mrs. Delacroix's death certificate, to ask if there might be any medical explanation for the continued muscle movement. He assured me that after 48 hours, such movement was virtually impossible. "Are you sure the embalming was thorough?" he asked. "Completely. I've never had a case like this." "Well, these things happen sometimes. Bodies can be unpredictable, even after death. Just do what you can to keep the family comfortable." Friday evening brought more visitors, including several elderly friends from Mrs. Delacroix's church. I found myself checking the Magnolia Room every 20 minutes, each time finding that her mouth had opened slightly wider. By 8 o'clock, the gap was pronounced enough that I could see her tongue, still pink, despite the embalming process. An elderly man named Mr. Boudreau approached me near closing time, his face troubled. "Young man, I need to tell you something. I was sitting with Evangeline earlier, saying my goodbyes, and I could swear I heard her whisper something." My blood chilled. "What did you think you heard, sir?" She said Louis, clear as day. That was her husband's name he passed 5 years ago. I thought maybe it was just the air conditioning or something, but he shook his head. It sounded like her voice. After the visitors left Friday night, I took more drastic measures. I removed the previous support structure and installed a more comprehensive wire framework, effectively wiring Mrs. Delacroix's jaw shut in a way that would make any movement impossible. The procedure took nearly an hour, and I triple-checked my work before wheeling her back to storage. Saturday was the final day of viewing, scheduled to end at 6 with the casket being closed for Monday's funeral service. I arrived early to make sure everything was perfect for Mrs. Delacroix's last day above ground. Her mouth was wide open, not just slightly agapefully open, as if she were in the middle of calling someone's name. The wire framework I'd installed was still in place, undamaged. Yet somehow her jaw had moved far enough to stretch the skin at the corners of her mouth. I stood beside the casket for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. In 11 years of embalming, I'd never encountered anything that defied the basic laws of physics like this. Dead muscle tissue simply doesn't contract. Embalmed bodies don't move. Yet Mrs. Delacroix was clearly trying to tell me something. The viewing began at 10, and I stationed myself near the Magnolia Room to monitor the situation. Throughout the morning, Mrs. Delacroix's mouth remained open, but the family seemed to accept my explanation about post-mortem muscle relaxation. It wasn't until Marie's teenage granddaughter, Sophie, came to pay her respects that things took a turn I still can't explain. Sophie approached the casket alone, as teenagers often do when they need a private moment to process grief. I watched from the doorway as she leaned close to her great-grandmother's face, probably whispering her own goodbye. Then Sophie stepped back quickly, her face pale. "Mom," she called to Marie, "come here. Grandma Evangeline is talking." Marie hurried over, followed by several other family members. I moved closer, my heart pounding. "What did you hear, honey?" Marie asked. "She said, 'Louis is here.'" She said it twice. I looked down at Mrs. Delacroix's face. Her mouth was still open, but now there was something different about her expression. Not urgent anymore, but peaceful, content. "That's impossible," Marie said gently. "Grandma can't." "I heard it too," interrupted Mrs. Boudreau, an elderly woman who'd been standing quietly nearby. She said, "Louis is here." And then she said, "I'm ready." The room fell silent. I stared at Mrs. Delacroix's face, searching for any sign of the movement that would explain what the family thought they'd heard. But she was completely still. Her features relaxed into the most peaceful expression I'd seen since she'd arrived at our facility. Over the next hour, 3 more visitors mentioned hearing Mrs. Delacroix speak. Each time, they reported the same words, "Louis is here," and "I'm ready." Each time, I observed her carefully and saw no movement whatsoever. At 6 o'clock, as scheduled, I closed Mrs. Delacroix's casket for the final time. Her mouth was still open, but her face held that serene, contented expression. As I lowered the lid, I could have sworn I heard the faintest whisper, not words, exactly, but the soft sound of someone exhaling in relief. The funeral service Monday morning proceeded without incident. Mrs. Delacroix was buried beside her husband Louis in St. Catherine's Cemetery, in a plot they'd purchased together 40 years earlier. That evening, Marie stopped by the funeral home to thank me for taking such good care of her mother. "I want you to know," she said, "that what happened during the viewing, it gave us all such peace. Mama spent 5 years missing Daddy. Knowing that she found him before she left us, that means everything." I nodded and smiled, but I didn't tell Marie what I'd discovered when I was preparing her mother's casket for transport to the cemetery. Hidden beneath the satin lining, I'd found a small piece of paper with Mrs. Delacroix's handwriting. It was a note to her husband, dated the day before she died. "Louis, if you're waiting for me, give me a sign. I'm ready to come home." Some messages, I've learned, are too important to let death interfere with their delivery. And sometimes, the dead know exactly what they need to say, even when their voices should have been silenced forever. The dead have never been good passengers, but lately they've been trying to get my attention. I'm Marcus Reed, and I've been driving transport for Westfield Mortuary Services for 7 years. My route covers 3 counties, picking up the deceased from hospitals, nursing homes, and private residences, then delivering them to funeral homes for preparation. It's quiet work, mostly night shifts when traffic is light, and families don't have to see their loved ones being moved in the back of what looks like a white panel van. The job suits me. I've always preferred the company of the dead to the living. My regular route takes me through downtown, past the old industrial district, and out to the suburban funeral homes that handle most of our business. It's a 40-minute drive on a good night, longer when there's construction or accidents. But 3 months ago, I discovered a shortcut that could save me 15 minutes on each Runa-winding road that cuts through Millbrook Cemetery and connects directly to Highway 92. The cemetery's back entrance is barely marked, just a narrow gap in the wrought iron fence that most people miss. The road inside is older than the main cemetery paths, paved with stones that were laid sometime in the 1920s. It curves between the oldest sections of Millbrook, past monuments that date back to the Civil War era, before emerging near the highway, where the newer developments begin. I started using the cemetery route in late March, after a particularly busy week when I'd been running behind schedule every night. The first few trips were uneventful, just the usual sounds of the van's engine echoing off the headstones and the soft creak of the casket restraints in the back. But by the end of that first week, I began to notice something unusual. 3 soft knocks, always from behind me, always while I was driving through the cemetery. At first, I attributed the sounds to the road itself. The old stone pavement was uneven in places, and I figured the casket was shifting slightly as I navigated the curves. But the knocks were too regular, too deliberate. They came in sets of 3, with precisely timed intervals between them, followed by complete silence until I exited the cemetery gates. The pattern was always the same: tap, 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 a pause of exactly 5 seconds, then nothing until the next delivery. I mentioned it to Jerry, the dispatcher, during one of our weekly check-ins. "Probably just the suspension," he said, not looking up from his clipboard. "That van's got 120,000 miles on it. Have maintenance take a look if you're worried." Maintenance found nothing wrong with the van. The suspension was fine, the casket restraint system was properly installed, and all the mounting brackets were secure. The mechanic, Pete, even rode along on one of my cemetery runs to hear the sounds for himself. "I don't hear anything unusual," he said as we pulled out of Millbrook's back gate. "Just normal road noise." But I heard them. 3 knocks, clear as day, coming from the cargo area where Mrs. Chen's casket was secured for transport to Riverside Funeral Home. After Pete's ride-along, I tried a different approach. I started keeping a small digital recorder in the van, activated whenever I entered the cemetery route. For 2 weeks, I recorded every delivery that went through Millbrook, then listened to the playback during my breaks. The recordings were silent, except for engine noise and the occasional bump from the stone road. Whatever I was hearing wasn't being picked up by the recorder. That's when I realized the knocks weren't random. They corresponded to specific caskets, not all of them, but certain ones that seemed to trigger the sounds. I started keeping detailed notes: the deceased's name, the type of casket, the funeral home destination, and whether I heard the knocking during transport. A pattern emerged. The sounds only occurred with caskets made from specific materials: mahogany, oak, and especially rosewood. Metal caskets made the trip through Millbrook in complete silence. Budget pine boxes were quiet too, but the expensive hardwood caskets, the ones that families chose for their lasting beauty and craftsmanship, those were the ones that knocked. 3 months into using the cemetery route, I got my strangest delivery yet. The pickup was from Mercy General, an elderly man named Thomas Garrett, who'd passed away after a long illness. His family had chosen a custom rosewood casket with brass fittings, the kind that costs more than most people make in a year. As I loaded Mr. Garrett's casket into the van, I noticed something unusual. The funeral director, a nervous young man named David, kept glancing at the casket as if he expected it to move. "Is everything secured properly?" he asked, checking the restraints for the 3rd time. "Everything's fine," I assured him. "I've been doing this for 7 years. It's just," his family mentioned some concerns about the viewing. They said he looked restless, like he was trying to say something. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but," David lowered his voice. During the embalming, his mouth kept falling open. "We had to wire it shut, but even then..." He didn't finish the sentence, just stepped back from the van and wished me a safe drive. The delivery was scheduled for Oakwood Memorial, about 30 minutes away if I took the highway route. But I'd been using the Millbrook shortcut for months without any real problems, and I was running late after a difficult pickup earlier in the evening. I decided to take the cemetery route one more time. As soon as I passed through Millbrook's back entrance, the knocking began, but this time it was different. Instead of the usual 3 measured taps, I heard a rapid series of knocks, urgent, almost frantic. They came in waves, building in intensity as I drove deeper into the cemetery. I pulled over near a section of old mausoleums and turned off the engine. The knocking stopped immediately, leaving only the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of highway traffic. I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, trying to decide what to do. In 7 years of transport work, I'd never had a situation like this. The rational part of my mind knew that dead bodies don't knock on casket lids, but the sounds were unmistakable, and they were coming from directly behind me. Against my better judgment, I got out of the van and walked to the rear doors. The knocking resumed as soon as I touched the handle 3 sharp raps, exactly like I'd been hearing for months. But now I could feel the vibration through the metal doors, a definite impact from inside the cargo area. I opened the van's rear doors and stared at Mr. Garrett's rosewood casket. It looked exactly as it had when I'd loaded it properly secured, completely sealed, showing no signs of movement. But as I watched, I heard the knocks again, and this time I saw something that made my blood freeze. The casket lid was moving, not opening that would have been impossible with the latching system fully engaged, but flexing slightly with each knock, as if someone were pressing against it from the inside. I grabbed my flashlight and examined the casket more closely. The rosewood surface was smooth and unmarked. The brass fittings were polished and secure. There was no physical explanation for what I was seeing and hearing. Then I noticed something else. Scratched into the stone pavement beside the van, so faint they were almost invisible, were words that looked like they'd been carved with fingernails. "Let me out!" I backed away from the van, my hands shaking. The knocking had stopped again, but I could feel something watching me from the shadows between the mausoleums. The air inside the cemetery felt thick, oppressive, as if the weight of all those buried bodies was pressing down on the living world above them. I climbed back into the driver's seat and started the engine, determined to get out of Millbrook as quickly as possible. But as I shifted into drive, the knocking resumed with a vengeance. Not just 3 taps now, but a continuous hammering that sounded like fists pounding against wood. The sound followed me all the way to the cemetery's exit, growing louder and more desperate with each passing second. Just as I reached the gates, it stopped completely, leaving only the normal sounds of the van's engine and the highway beyond. I delivered Mr. Garrett's casket to Oakwood Memorial without further incident. The funeral director there accepted the delivery with routine professionalism, showing no sign that anything unusual had occurred during transport. As far as he was concerned, it was just another quiet passenger making their final journey. But I knew better. Something in Millbrook Cemetery had awakened, something that recognized the sound of expensive wood and quality craftsmanship. Something that remembered what it was like to be trapped in a box, waiting for someone to hear their calls for help. I've stopped using the cemetery route. The extra 15 minutes isn't worth the risk of encountering whatever lives in the shadows between those old monuments. My deliveries take longer now, but they're silent the way transport work is supposed to be. Sometimes, though, when I'm driving past Millbrook's main entrance on the highway, I can hear them in the distant stazons of voices knocking in unison from beneath the earth, 3 taps at a time, waiting for someone to let them out. Some comfort comes from places that shouldn't exist, and people who never were. I'm Patricia Winters, and I've been managing Serenity Memorial Funeral Home for 16 years. In that time, I've guided thousands of families through the most difficult moments of their lives, helping them navigate the complex emotions of loss while arranging the practical details of saying goodbye. I thought I knew every corner of our facility, every service we offered, every staff member who worked under our roof, but lately I've been learning that grief can create its own reality. Serenity Memorial sits on 3 acres of carefully maintained grounds in the heart of Millfield, a town that's grown up around us since we opened in 1952. The main building houses our chapel, viewing rooms, and administrative offices, while the older wing contains the preparation rooms and storage areas. Behind the building, there's a parking area and a strip of landscaped lawn that runs along the property. Nothing fancy, just some basic shrubs and a concrete walkway that we use for overflow parking during large services. My office overlooks this back area, and in all my years here, it's never been anything more than functional space. No gardens, no seating areas, no place where families would naturally gather for private conversations. Yet 3 weeks ago, something started happening that's made me question everything I thought I knew about our facility. It began with Mrs. Rodriguez, whose husband had passed after a long battle with cancer. She was in my office finalizing the arrangements for his memorial service when she mentioned how helpful our grief counselor had been. "Dr. Cross was wonderful," she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "She spent over an hour with me in the rose garden yesterday, just listening and helping me understand that what I'm feeling is normal. You're so lucky to have someone like that on your staff. I paused in my note-taking. I'm sorry, Mrs. Rodriguez, but I think there might be some confusion. We don't have a grief counselor on staff, and we don't have a rose garden. Mrs. Rodriguez looked puzzled. But I met with her yesterday afternoon. Dr. Helen Cross. She said she worked here at Serenity Memorial. We sat on a bench, surrounded by the most beautiful white roses I've ever seen. I walked Mrs. Rodriguez to the back of the building and showed her the concrete area behind our facility. This is all we have back here. Are you sure you didn't meet with someone at another funeral home? She stared at the empty space, her confusion deepening. I could have sworn, but maybe I'm just not thinking clearly. Grief does strange things to your mind, doesn't it? I assured her that confusion was normal during times of loss and made a note to follow up with her later. But 2 days after Mr. Rodriguez's funeral, I received a thank you card from the family specifically mentioning Dr. Cross and the comfort she'd provided during their time of need. The second incident occurred the following week. The Tombstone family was arranging services for their teenage daughter, a tragic car accident that had shaken our entire community. During our initial meeting, Mr. Tombstone mentioned how grateful they were for our comprehensive grief support services. The counselor you have here is remarkable, he said. Dr. Cross helped my wife understand that the anger she's feeling toward the other driver is part of the healing process. They spent most of yesterday afternoon in your rose garden, and Sarah came home more peaceful than she's been since the accident. Again, I had to explain that we didn't employ a grief counselor and didn't have a rose garden. Again, the family looked confused but accepted my explanation as a mistake brought on by emotional stress. But this time, I decided to investigate. I pulled the security footage from our parking lot cameras, looking for any evidence of the Tombstone family meeting with an unknown woman in our back area. The cameras covered the rear of the building with a clear view of the concrete space behind our facility. I reviewed 3 days of footage, fast-forwarding through hours of empty parking area and occasional staff members taking smoke breaks. There was no sign of any meeting, no evidence of anyone spending time in what the families described as a rose garden. Yet the thank you notes kept coming. Over the next 2 weeks, 4 more families mentioned Dr. Helen Cross and the beautiful rose garden where she'd provided counseling services. Each family described the same experience, a compassionate woman in her 50s with silver hair and kind eyes, who listened without judgment and offered gentle guidance about processing grief. I began asking more detailed questions. Where exactly did they meet Dr. Cross? How did they know to find her? What did the rose garden look like? The answers were remarkably consistent. Families said they'd been directed to the rose garden by funeral home staff, though none of my employees remembered giving such directions. They described walking around the back of the building and finding a small but beautiful garden with white rose bushes arranged around a wrought iron bench. Dr. Cross would be waiting there, always dressed in a simple navy blue dress, always carrying a small leather journal where she would occasionally jot down notes during their conversations. The strangest part was how the families found her. They all said the same thing. During their most difficult moments at the funeral home, while viewing their loved one's body or struggling to choose burial arrangements, a staff member would quietly mention that Dr. Cross was available in the rose garden if they needed someone to talk to. But when I questioned my employees, none of them remembered making such suggestions. 3 weeks into this mystery, I decided to spend an entire afternoon stationed at my office window, watching the back area of our building. The Hendricks family was scheduled for a viewing that day. Their patriarch had passed peacefully at age 87, and based on the pattern, I suspected they might mention Dr. Cross during their visit. At 2 in the afternoon, I watched Mrs. Hendricks walk slowly around the back of the building, moving as if she knew exactly where she was going. She stopped at the edge of the concrete area and stood perfectly still for several minutes, looking at something I couldn't see from my window. I grabbed my jacket and went outside to check on her, concerned that she might be having some kind of episode. But when I rounded the corner of the building, Mrs. Hendricks was gone. The concrete area was empty, showing no sign that anyone had been there. I searched the entire property, thinking she might have wandered off or become confused. I found her 20 minutes later in our main chapel, sitting quietly beside her husband's casket. When I asked if she was all right, she smiled peacefully. "Oh, yes, dear, Dr. Cross was so helpful." She reminded me that Harold is finally free from pain, and that the love we shared for 62 years doesn't end just because his body has stopped working. We had such a lovely conversation in the rose garden. That evening, I stayed late at the office, reviewing security footage from the afternoon. The cameras clearly showed Mrs. Hendricks walking around the back of the building at 2:05 p.m. She stood at the edge of the concrete area for exactly 14 minutes, occasionally nodding and moving her lips as if engaged in conversation. Then she simply walked back toward the main building, appearing calm and comforted. But the cameras showed no sign of Dr. Cross. No rose garden, no bench, just an elderly woman talking to empty air above a patch of concrete. The next morning, I called the previous owners of our property to ask about the history of the land behind our building. The records showed that from 1923 to 1948, the space had housed a small private practice Dr. Helen Cross, licensed clinical psychologist, specializing in grief counseling and bereavement therapy. According to the county archives, Dr. Cross had maintained a small office building with an adjoining memorial garden where she met with clients dealing with loss. The building had been demolished when Serenity Memorial purchased the property, but the garden had remained until 1955, when it was paved over to create additional parking space. Dr. Cross herself had passed away in 1963, but the record showed she'd spent 35 years helping people process their grief in the exact spot where families now claim to meet with her. I found a photograph in the Historical Society's Archivessa newspaper, clipping from 1946, showing Dr. Cross in her memorial garden. She was a woman in her 50s, with silver hair and kind eyes, dressed in a simple navy blue dress, sitting on a wrought iron bench, surrounded by white rose bushes. The woman in the photograph looked exactly as the families had described her. That afternoon, I walked to the back of our building and stood on the concrete where Dr. Cross's garden had once bloomed. I couldn't see roses or benches or anything beyond our functional parking area. But for just a moment, I caught the faint scent of flowers on the wind, sweet and comforting, like roses in full bloom. I understand now that some forms of help transcend the boundaries of life and death. Dr. Helen Cross spent decades in that garden, offering comfort to people in their darkest moments. When the garden was paved over, when her building was torn down, when she herself passed away, something essential remained, a presence dedicated to easing the pain of loss. The families still mention Dr. Cross and her rose garden. I've stopped trying to explain that neither exists because I've learned that comfort comes in many forms, and some of the most meaningful help comes from places we can't see, and people who refuse to let death end their calling. Every week, I receive thank you notes mentioning the beautiful woman in the navy blue dress who sits among the white roses, listening with infinite patience to stories of love and loss. And every week, I'm reminded that healing sometimes requires believing in something that shouldn't be possible, but somehow, miraculously, is. The dead keep their own schedule, and lately they've been running late for something important. I'm Eddie Kowalski, and I've been the night maintenance supervisor at Restwood Cemetery for 9 years. Most people think cemetery work is creepy, but the truth is, it's one of the most peaceful jobs you can have. The dead don't complain, they don't make messes, and they certainly don't cause trouble. At least, that's what I used to believe before the lights started following invisible visitors through our grounds. Restwood spans 47 acres of rolling hills on the outskirts of Millbrook, with sections dating back to 1873. The newer areas are well maintained, with modern sprinkler systems and paved walkways, but the older sections, particularly around the Victorian-era mausoleum, require more hands-on care. That's where I spend most of my nights, checking irrigation lines, clearing debris, and making sure the motion sensor security lights are functioning properly. The security system was installed 5 years ago after a series of vandalism incidents. 24 motion-activated LED lights create a network covering the main pathways and the mausoleum area, designed to deter unwanted visitors and provide safety for our daytime staff. The lights are sensitive enough to detect a person walking within 30 feet, but not so sensitive that they're triggered by small animals or wind-blown branches. In all the years since installation, the system has worked flawlessly. The lights illuminate when someone approaches, stay on for 90 seconds, then automatically shut off. Simple, reliable, and effective. But 3 weeks ago, something started happening that's made me question everything I thought I knew about our quiet cemetery. It began on a Tuesday night in late October. I was doing my usual rounds, checking the irrigation controls near the old section, when I noticed the motion lights activating in sequence along the main pathway. Someone was walking from the cemetery entrance toward the mausoleum, triggering each light as they passed beneath it. This wasn't unusual by itself. Occasionally, we get late-night visitors who need to pay respects to recently departed loved ones. What was unusual was the timing. It was 2:47 in the morning, well past the cemetery's posted hours, and I hadn't seen any cars in the parking area. I walked toward the mausoleum to check on whoever had entered the grounds, but by the time I reached the central pathway, the lights had stopped activating. The area was empty, with no sign of any visitor. I assumed they'd heard me coming and left quickly, perhaps embarrassed about being in the cemetery after hours. But the next night, the same thing happened. 2:47 a.m., motion lights activating in perfect sequence from the entrance to the mausoleum. This time, I was positioned where I could see the entire pathway. The lights illuminated one after another, creating a clear trail of movement, but I saw no one walking beneath them. I checked the security cameras the next morning, reviewing the footage from both nights. The cameras clearly showed the lights activating in sequence, but the infrared images revealed nothing that could have triggered them. No people, no animals, no moving objects of any kind. Just empty pathways and the steady procession of lights turning on and off. I called the security company to report a possible malfunction, but their technician found nothing wrong with the system. He tested each sensor individually and confirmed they were working within normal parameters. Could be electromagnetic interference, he suggested. Sometimes radio signals or electrical equipment can cause false triggers. Are there any new installations nearby? There weren't. Restwood sits in a quiet area with no major construction or new electrical systems that could interfere with our sensors. The nightly light sequence continued for a week, always at 2:47 a.m., always following the same path from entrance to mausoleum. I started timing the progression and found it was remarkably consistent. Each light stayed on for exactly 90 seconds before the next one activated, suggesting someone was walking at a steady pace of about 2 miles per hour. On the 8th night, I decided to position myself at the mausoleum entrance before the lights started their sequence. If something invisible was walking our pathways, I wanted to be there when it arrived. The mausoleum at Restwood is an impressive Gothic structure built in 1892 by the wealthy Morrison family. It houses 12 crypts arranged in 2 levels, with elaborate stone carvings and stained glass windows that catch the moonlight beautifully. The building has been sealed since 1953, when the last Morrison family member was interred. I waited in the shadows beside the mausoleum's iron doors, watching the pathway for the first sign of the approaching lights. At exactly 2:47 a.m., the sequence began. Light after light illuminated the pathway, moving steadily toward my position. But even standing just 10 feet away, I could see nothing that would trigger the sensors. As the final light, the one directly in front of the mausoleum, activated, I felt a sudden chill in the air. Not the natural cold of an October night, but something deeper, as if the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in an instant. My breath became visible, and I could hear the faint sound of footsteps on gravel, though the pathway in front of me remained empty. The footsteps stopped directly in front of the mausoleum doors. I stood perfectly still, afraid to move or make any sound. The motion light stayed on, illuminated by whatever presence had triggered it, and in that harsh LED glow, I began to see something that shouldn't have been possible. Footprints, fresh impressions in the soft soil beside the pathway, appearing one after another as if someone invisible were walking in place. The prints were small, narrow, like those of a woman wearing dress shoes. They circled the mausoleum entrance once, then moved to a newer section of crypts that had been added to the structure in the 1940s. I followed the trail of footprints with my flashlight, watching in fascination and terror as new impressions appeared in the soil. The invisible visitor seemed to be examining the crypts, pausing at each nameplate before moving to the next. When the footprints reached the crypt marked Eleanor Morrison, beloved wife and mother, died 1953, they stopped completely. The motion light shut off, leaving me alone in the moonlight with a trail of impossible footprints leading to a grave that had been sealed for over 70 years. I spent the rest of the night in my maintenance shed, drinking coffee and trying to make sense of what I'd witnessed. When dawn broke, I returned to the mausoleum to examine the area in daylight. The footprints were still there, clear impressions in the damp soil, but now I noticed something else. The crypt that the footprints had led to Eleanor Morrison's final resting place showed signs of recent activity. The stone sealing the entrance had shifted slightly, leaving a hairline crack along one edge. Fresh scratches marked the stone around the crack, as if someone had been trying to pry the seal loose from the inside. I checked our maintenance records and found that Eleanor Morrison's crypt had been inspected just 6 months ago as part of our routine structural assessment. At that time, it showed no signs of damage or deterioration. The seal had been solid and undisturbed. I called the cemetery director, Mr. Hutchinson, to report the damage. He arrived within an hour, accompanied by a representative from the Morrison Family Trust. Together, we examined the crypt and the surrounding area. "This is very unusual," Mr. Hutchinson said, running his finger along the crack in the stone seal. "These crypts are built to last centuries. For the seal to fail like this..." The Morrison family representative, a lawyer named Mrs. Chen, was more direct. "We'll need to have this properly inspected and resealed immediately. The family trust specifically requires that all Morrison graves remain undisturbed in perpetuity." A restoration crew arrived that afternoon to assess the damage and reseal Eleanor Morrison's crypt. As they worked, one of the workers made a discovery that chilled me to the bone. "There's something behind this stone," he called out, peering through the crack with a flashlight. "Looks like there might be some kind of opening that wasn't properly sealed during the original construction." They carefully removed the damaged stone seal and found exactly what the worker had described: a narrow opening that led not to Eleanor Morrison's remains, but to a hidden chamber behind her crypt. The chamber was small, barely large enough for a person to stand in, and it contained something that had apparently been waiting there for 70 years. A suitcase, old leather, carefully preserved in the dry chamber air. Inside the suitcase were women's clothes, travel documents, and a substantial amount of cash enough to start a new life somewhere, far from Millbrook. Mrs. Chen examined the documents with growing astonishment. "These are Eleanor Morrison's," she said. "Travel tickets to California, dated October 1953. But that's impossible. Eleanor died in September of that year." Mr. Hutchinson and I exchanged glances. The official story had always been that Eleanor Morrison died of pneumonia in her family home and was interred in the mausoleum according to her wishes. But the evidence suggested something very different, that Eleanor had planned to escape her life in Millbrook and had hidden the means to do so behind her own future grave. We sealed the chamber and restored Eleanor Morrison's crypt, replacing the stone with modern materials that would prevent any future deterioration. Mrs. Chen took possession of the suitcase and its contents, promising to investigate the historical discrepancies. But the nightly light sequence continued. Every night at 2:47 a.m., the motion sensors detect something walking from the cemetery entrance to the mausoleum. The cameras still show nothing, but now I understand what's happening. Eleanor Morrison is still trying to retrieve her suitcase, still planning her escape from a life that ended 70 years ago. Each night, she makes the journey to her crypt, hoping to find that the way is finally open, that the chamber behind her grave will yield the freedom she never had in life. I've stopped trying to intercept her nightly walks. Some journeys, I've learned, are too important to interrupt, even when they're made by feet that left their last footprints decades ago. Instead, I've taken to leaving a small light on near the mausoleum, a simple courtesy for a visitor who's been walking the same path for longer than I've been alive. The dead, it turns out, are more persistent than the living. And sometimes, the most important destinations are the ones we never quite manage to reach. There's nothing more unsettling than finding your own handwriting in a place it shouldn't exist, documenting events that happened before you were alive. I'm Donna Fletcher, and I've been the records clerk at Oakdale Cemetery for 12 years. My office sits in the basement of the administrative building, surrounded by filing cabinets that contain over a century of burial documentation. Every death, every interment, every plot transfer since 1879 is cataloged in these files, handwritten ledgers from the early years, typewritten forms from the middle decades, and computer printouts from the modern era. It's meticulous work that requires absolute accuracy, because these records serve as the legal documentation for every grave in our 120-acre cemetery. The filing system is straightforward: chronological order by date of burial, with cross-referenced indexes for name searches and plot location queries. I maintain both the historical records and the current database, ensuring that families can locate their loved ones and that new burials don't accidentally disturb existing graves. In 12 years of managing these files, I've never encountered a discrepancy that couldn't be explained by clerical error or incomplete historical documentation. That changed 3 weeks ago when I was updating our digital archive with burial records from 1947. I'd been working systematically through the post-war files, scanning documents and creating database entries for burials that had only existed in handwritten ledgers. It was routine work, the kind of detailed, methodical process that I find oddly comforting in its predictability. I was reviewing the burial record for Margaret Henley, interred April 15, 1947, when I noticed something that made me stop mid-keystroke. The handwriting on the form looked familiar, not just similar to mine, but identical. The careful way the letter M was formed, the slight rightward slant of the text, even the particular way I dotted my I's, with small circles rather than simple dots. I compared the 1947 form to some of my recent work, holding the documents side by side. The handwriting was unmistakably the same, down to the smallest details of letter formation and spacing. But that was impossible. Margaret Henley had been buried 26 years before I was born. I attributed the similarity to coincidence and continued my work, but over the next several days, I found more examples. A burial record from 1952 for Thomas Crawford, written in my exact handwriting. Another from 1958 for the infant Sarah Peterson, with my distinctive script documenting her brief life and burial in the children's section. Each time I found one of these anomalous records, I checked the corresponding gravesite to verify the information. The headstones matched the documentation: perfect erect names, correct dates, proper plot locations. Everything was in order, except for the impossible fact that these records appeared to have been written by me decades before my birth. I began keeping a separate file of the questionable documents, photographing each one and noting the discrepancies. After 2 weeks, I had 17 burial records spanning from 1947 to 1962, all written in my handwriting, all documenting burials that occurred when I shouldn't have existed. The most disturbing discovery came when I examined the ink on these documents. Despite their supposed age, the writing appeared fresh, not the faded brown of decades-old ink, but the deep blue of a pen that had been used recently. When I tested one of the documents with a magnifying glass, I could see that the ink hadn't fully dried into the paper fibers the way it should have after 60 years. I decided to test my theory by staying late one evening to monitor the filing cabinets. If someone was somehow adding these forged documents to our historical files, I wanted to catch them in the act. I positioned myself where I could see the main filing area and settled in for a long night of surveillance. Around 11 p.m., I heard the sound of papers rustling from the section containing the 1950s records. I moved quietly toward the filing cabinets, expecting to find an intruder, but the basement office was empty. The sound had stopped, leaving only the hum of the building's ventilation system. I checked the filing drawer for 1954 and found a new document that hadn't been there that afternoon, a burial record for William Hayes, dated September 3rd, 1954. The form was written in my handwriting, the ink still slightly damp, as if it had been completed just minutes before. But I hadn't written it. I'd been sitting across the room the entire evening, and no one else had entered the basement office. I examined William Hayes' burial record more carefully and noticed something that chilled me. The form was filled out completely: name, age, cause of death, plot location, next of kin, but one detail was different from the other documents I'd found. This record included a section for record keeper, and in that space, written in my exact handwriting, was my name, Donna Fletcher. I rushed upstairs to check our computer database for any record of William Hayes. According to our digital files, he'd been buried in plot 47B on September 3rd, 1954, exactly as documented in the handwritten form. The database entry had been created during my initial digitization project 3 months ago, based on what I'd assumed was an original 1954 document. But now I realized the truth. I'd been creating these records myself, somehow writing documentation for burials that had occurred decades before my birth. The computer entries existed because I'd dutifully transcribed them from forms that I'd apparently written myself, creating a perfect loop of self-referential documentation. The next morning, I drove to plot 47B to verify William Hayes' burial. The headstone was there, weathered granite with his name, and dates carved in the style typical of the 1950s. But when I checked the ground around the grave, I found something that made my hands tremble. Fresh soil. The earth around William Hayes' headstone had been recently disturbed, as if someone had been digging near the gravesite within the last few days. The surrounding plots showed the settled, undisturbed ground you'd expect from 60-year-old burials, but William Hayes' grave looked like it had been active recently. I contacted the cemetery's groundskeeper to ask if any maintenance work had been done in that section. He checked his records and confirmed that no excavation or repair work had taken place in plot 47B for over a decade. That evening, I returned to the basement office with a video camera, determined to document whatever was happening to our filing system. I set up the camera to record the 1950s filing section and left it running overnight, hoping to capture evidence of the mysterious record creation. The next morning, I found another new document, this time a burial record for elderly Rose Patterson, dated October 12, 1955. The form was written in my handwriting, with ink that was still slightly tacky to the touch. But when I reviewed the video footage, I saw something that defied all logic and reason. At 3:17 a.m., the camera clearly showed me entering the frame, pulling out the 1955 filing drawer, and carefully writing Rose Patterson's burial record. I watched myself work with meticulous care, filling out every section of the form in my distinctive handwriting. The figure on the video looked exactly like Mesame height, same build, same clothes I'd worn to work that day. But I'd been home in bed at 3:17 a.m., 8 miles away from the cemetery office. I rewound the footage and watched again, studying every detail of the figure's movements. The way she held the pen, the slight pause she made when thinking about what to write next, even the unconscious habit of tucking her hair behind her everything was exactly as I would have done it. But it wasn't me. I spent the rest of that day comparing the video to photographs of myself, looking for any detail that might distinguish the figure from my actual appearance. There were none. The woman writing burial records in the middle of the night was, in every observable way, identical to me. Over the following week, I found 7 more burial records, each one appearing overnight in the appropriate filing drawer, each one written in my handwriting, each one documenting a burial that had allegedly occurred decades before my birth. The video camera captured the same impossible scene each time a woman who looked exactly like me, working diligently to document deaths and burials from an era I'd never lived through. I began researching the history of Oakdale Cemetery's record-keeping system, hoping to find some explanation for what I was experiencing. The cemetery's archives contained employment records dating back to its founding, and what I discovered there made my blood run cold. From 1947 to 1962, Oakdale Cemetery had employed a records clerk named Donna Fletcher. According to the personnel files, she'd been hired at age 25 and had worked in the same basement office where I now spent my days. Her job description was identical to mine: maintaining burial records, updating filing systems, ensuring accurate documentation of all cemetery activities. The employment record included a photograph of a young woman who looked exactly like me, down to the same facial features, the same hair color, even the same slight smile I recognized from my own driver's license photo. Donna Fletcher, the previous Donna Fletcher, had disappeared in 1962. The personnel file noted that she'd simply stopped coming to work one day, leaving behind a perfectly organized filing system and no explanation for her departure. Her final time card was dated November 7th, 1962. That night, I found one last burial record in the filing system, a document dated November 8th, 1962, written in my unmistakable handwriting. But this record was different from all the others. Instead of documenting someone else's burial, it recorded the death and interment of Donna Fletcher herself, age 35, buried in Plot 91C. The cause of death was listed as unknown circumstances, and in the section reserved for next of kin, someone had written, "None found." I drove to Plot 91C that morning and found a simple headstone bearing my name and the date 1962. The grave was real, properly maintained, with settled earth that suggested it had been undisturbed for decades. But the records clerk who documented her own burial was still working in the basement office at Oakdale Cemetery, writing meticulous entries for burials that had happened before she was born, creating documentation for a history she'd lived through once before and would apparently live through again. I haven't been back to the basement office since that morning. Someone else will have to maintain the burial records now. Someone else will have to update the filing system and ensure the accuracy of our documentation. Because I finally understand what happened to the first Donna Fletcher, and I know what will happen to me if I keep returning to that basement office night after night. Some jobs, it seems, come with obligations that extend far beyond a single lifetime. And some people are hired to do work they've already completed, in a place where time moves in circles rather than straight lines. The dead have been sending us payments, and their checks keep clearing even though their accounts were closed with their coffins. I'm Vincent Morales, and I've been head groundskeeper at Hillside Memorial Cemetery for 8 years. My responsibilities include maintaining the grounds, coordinating burials, and handling the administrative side of cemetery operations, everything from scheduling maintenance crews to processing the paperwork that keeps a 100-year-old cemetery running smoothly. It's steady work that requires attention to detail and respect for the families who trust us with their most precious memories. Part of my weekly routine involves collecting mail from our post office box and sorting through the various payments and correspondence that arrive regularly. Most of it is routine business: flower delivery confirmations, equipment invoices, and the monthly perpetual care payments that fund our ongoing maintenance operations. Perpetual care is essentially cemetery insurance families pay a fee to ensure their loved ones' graves are maintained indefinitely, no matter what happens to the cemetery's ownership or financial situation. The payments typically arrive as checks or money orders, usually from elderly family members who want to guarantee their relatives' final resting places remain dignified and well tended. I process these payments every Tuesday, recording them in our books and depositing them at First National Bank downtown. In 8 years of handling these transactions, I've never encountered anything more unusual than the occasional check written in shaky handwriting or a payment memo that reads, "For Grandma's roses." That changed 3 weeks ago when I found an envelope in our mail that made me question everything I thought I knew about our financial records. The envelope was cream-colored and thick, with the sender's address written in careful cursive script: Harold Whitman, 1247 Maple Street, Millfield. Inside was a check for $500 made out to Hillside Memorial Cemetery, with "Perpetual Care" Plot 73A, written in the memo line. The signature was bold and confident, written with what appeared to be a fountain pen. I recognized the name immediately. Harold Whitman was buried in Plot 73A, right beneath the old oak tree in our 1950 section. He'd passed away in 2006 at age 82, and his wife had purchased perpetual care at the time of his burial. But according to our records, Mrs. Whitman had stopped making payments 5 years ago when she'd moved to Arizona to live with her daughter. I assumed there was some confusion, perhaps. Harold's son had decided to resume the perpetual care payments and had used his father's old checks by mistake. It happens sometimes when families are cleaning out estates and find unused checkbooks. I made a note to call the Whitman family to clarify the situation. But when I deposited the check at First National, something strange happened. The bank teller, Janet, who'd been processing our deposits for years, looked puzzled as she examined the check. "Vincent, this is odd. The routing number on this check is for an account that was closed in 2006, but it cleared our system this morning when you made the deposit." I asked her to double-check the account status. She pulled up the bank's records and confirmed what she'd said. Harold Whitman's checking account had been closed immediately following his death, as is standard procedure when account holders pass away. "But here's the really weird part," Janet continued. "I ran the signature through our verification system, and it matches the signature card we have on file for Harold Whitman. Perfect match, not similar identical." I took the check back to the cemetery and filed it with our other financial records, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong with what had just happened. Dead people don't write checks, and closed bank accounts don't process payments. The following Tuesday, I found another envelope in our mail. This one was from Dorothy Chen, 892 Elm Avenue, Millfield, containing a check for $300 for perpetual care of Plot 41B. Like Harold Whitman's check, the handwriting was clear and confident, and the signature appeared to be written with a quality pen. Dorothy Chen had been buried in Plot 41B in 1998. I drove directly to First National Bank and asked Janet to process Dorothy Chen's check immediately while I waited. She ran it through their system and came back with the same impossible result. The account had been closed for over 25 years, but the signature was a perfect match for their records, and the check had been approved for payment. "This doesn't make any sense," Janet said, staring at her computer screen. "Our system shows that Mrs. Chen's account was closed in December of 1998, but the check shows electronic approval at 8:47 this morning. That should be impossible." I asked Janet to contact the bank's main office to inquire about the account discrepancies. She called while I waited, speaking with supervisors and account verification specialists who were equally baffled by what they found. "They're saying the electronic signature verification is coming back positive, but there's no record of these accounts being active," Janet explained. "It's like the signatures are being authenticated against files that no longer exist in our system." Over the next 2 weeks, I received 7 more checks from deceased account holders, each one paying for perpetual care of their own graves. The amounts varied, some for a few $100s, others for over $1,000, but all were written in the clear, confident handwriting of people who'd been dead for years or even decades. I started keeping detailed records of each payment, noting the date of death for each check writer and cross-referencing their signatures with the cemetery documents I had on file. The signatures were consistently perfect matches for records from estate settlements and burial contracts signed years earlier. But it was the bank's explanation that truly unsettled me. When Janet contacted the regional office about the ongoing account anomalies, they discovered something that defied both banking regulations and basic logic. According to our electronic systems, the bank manager told me during a phone call, these accounts are simultaneously closed and active. The computer shows them as terminated upon the account holders' deaths, but our verification system is processing them as if they're current accounts in good standing. I asked how that was possible. "Honestly, Mr. Morales, we don't know. Our technical team is calling it a database error, but every attempt to correct the supposed glitch results in the same outcome. The accounts appear closed in our records, but they're functionally active for payment processing. The situation became even more bizarre when I decided to visit some of the graves associated with the perpetual care payments. I started with Harold Whitman's plot, which I'd been maintaining for years as part of our regular groundskeeping routine. Harold's grave looked better than it ever had. The grass around his headstone was perfectly trimmed, the flowers were fresh and vibrant, and the bronze marker gleamed as if it had been recently polished. This was unusual because our maintenance schedule for that section wasn't due for another week, and none of my crew members remembered working on Harold's plot recently. I checked Dorothy Chen's grave next, and found the same thing-immaculate maintenance that none of us had performed. The marble headstone was spotless, the surrounding landscape was perfectly manicured, and fresh flowers had been placed at the base of the monument. Every grave associated with the mysterious perpetual care payments showed signs of recent, meticulous maintenance that couldn't be accounted for by our normal work schedules. That evening, I decided to stay late at the cemetery to see if I could observe whoever was performing this unauthorized maintenance. I positioned myself in the groundskeeper's shed, where I had a clear view of the sections containing the graves in question. Around midnight, I began to see movement among the headstones. At first, it was just subtle shifts in the shadows between monuments, barely visible in the moonlight. But as I watched more carefully, I started to make out figures moving through the cemetery with purposeful intent. They were carrying gardening tools rakes, pruning shears, small watering cans, and they moved with the familiar efficiency of experienced groundskeepers. But these weren't my employees, and they weren't dressed in our standard work uniforms. Instead, they wore the clothing of different eras, men in suspenders and fedoras, women in house dresses and practical shoes, clothing styles that spanned decades of fashion. I watched as they worked methodically through the night, each figure focusing on a specific gravesite. Harold Whitman, or someone who looked exactly like the photographs I'd seen of him, was carefully tending to his own plot, trimming grass with small scissors and polishing his bronze marker with a soft cloth. Dorothy Chen was arranging fresh flowers around her headstone, working with the careful attention of someone who wanted everything to be perfect. They worked in complete silence, their movements graceful and unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world to ensure their final resting places met their exact standards of care and dignity. As dawn approached, the figures began to fade, becoming translucent before disappearing entirely. But their work remained perfectly maintained, graves that showed every sign of professional attention and personal care. I found one more check in Tuesday's mail, this one from Vincent Morales in my own handwriting, made out for perpetual care of a plot that didn't yet exist in our cemetery. The memo line read, "For when my time comes," and the signature was unmistakably mine, though I had no memory of writing it. When I called the bank to inquire about my own account, Janet told me something that made my blood run cold. "Vincent, according to our records, your account shows that this check was written and deposited 50 years from now. The date stamp in our system shows a transaction date that won't occur until 2075. I've stopped questioning the perpetual care payments. The checks continue to arrive each week, written by people who want to ensure their graves receive the attention they believe they deserve. The bank continues to process payments from accounts that exist in some space between closed and active, and the cemetery continues to benefit from funds that arrive from sources that shouldn't be able to send them. But I understand now that some responsibilities extend beyond life, and some payments are too important to let death interfere with their delivery. The dead are simply taking care of themselves, ensuring that their final resting places receive the perpetual care they purchased, one way or another." The living have started planning their own funerals, calling with voices I recognize but conversations that shouldn't be possible. I'm Michael Harrison, and I've been a licensed funeral director at Sunset Ridge Memorial for 13 years. My work involves guiding families through the most difficult decisions they'll ever make, helping them honor their loved ones while managing the practical details that death requires. It's a calling that demands both professional expertise and genuine compassion, because every conversation I have represents someone's final chapter and their family's first step toward healing. Most of my interactions follow familiar patterns. A family member calls to report a death and request our services. We discuss arrangements, select caskets and burial sites, coordinate with clergy or celebrants, and ensure that everything proceeds according to the deceased's wishes and the family's traditions. These conversations are often emotional, sometimes difficult, but always grounded in the reality of loss and the need to say goodbye with dignity. Our phone system logs all incoming calls automatically, recording the date, time, and caller ID for our administrative records. This helps us track correspondence with families and maintain accurate documentation for our services. In 13 years of funeral work, I've reviewed thousands of these call logs, and they've never shown anything more unusual than the occasional wrong number or inquiry about our cemetery policies. That changed 3 weeks ago when I received a call that challenged everything I thought I understood about the boundary between life and death. It was a Tuesday afternoon around 2 o'clock when my office phone rang. The caller ID showed a local number, and the voice on the other end was clear and confident. "Hello, this is Robert Henley. I'd like to discuss arrangements for my funeral service." I recognized the name immediately. Robert Henley was a retired school principal who lived about 10 minutes from our funeral home. I'd met him several times at community events, and his wife had served on our cemetery board for over a decade. What confused me was that Robert Henley was very much alive. I'd seen him at the grocery store just the previous weekend, looking healthy and engaged in conversation with neighbors. "I'm sorry, Mr. Henley," I said carefully. "Are you calling to make pre-arrangements for yourself, or are you inquiring about services for a family member?" "For myself," he replied without hesitation. "I passed away yesterday evening at Mercy General Hospital. Heart attack at 7:32 p.m. My wife will be calling you later today to confirm the details, but I wanted to make sure my preferences were clear." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Mr. Henley, I think there might be some confusion. According to our records, that is, we haven't received any notification of your passing." The voice on the phone chuckled softly. "I understand this might seem unusual, Michael, but I'm calling to request the mahogany casket with brass fittings, the one we discussed when Martha's mother passed last year. I'd like to be buried in plot 47 in the older section, beneath the oak tree where Martha and I used to sit during our evening walks through the cemetery." The specific details made my hands tremble as I took notes. Robert Henley had indeed inquired about casket options during his mother-in-law's funeral arrangements. And plot 47 was exactly where he and his wife often paused during their walks through Sunset Ridge. I'd seen them there myself on numerous occasions. "Mr. Henley, I need to ask you something directly. Are you calling from Mercy General Hospital?" "No, Michael. I'm calling from plot 47. The reception isn't very good down here, but I wanted to make sure you understood my wishes before Martha becomes too upset to handle the arrangements properly." The line went dead. I immediately called Mercy General to inquire about Robert Henley's status. The hospital confirmed that he was very much alive and had not been admitted for any medical treatment. I then called the Henley home, where Martha answered and confirmed that Robert was working in their garden and had been in perfect health for months. I made detailed notes about the conversation and filed them in our miscellaneous correspondence folder, assuming I'd experienced some kind of elaborate prank call or case of mistaken identity. But Robert Henley died 3 days later of a massive heart attack at Mercy General Hospital. Time of death, 7:32 p.m. Martha Henley called the next morning to arrange funeral services. When I asked about her preferences for casket selection and burial location, she told me exactly what I'd written in my notes from Tuesday's impossible phone call. "Robert always loved that mahogany casket with the brass fittings," she said through her tears, "and he wanted to be buried in plot 47 beneath the oak tree where we used to sit together." 2 weeks later, I received another call that followed the same impossible pattern. "This is Jennifer Walsh. I need to arrange my funeral service for next Tuesday." Jennifer Walsh was a local librarian whom I knew personally. She'd helped coordinate several memorial services at the library for prominent community members. Like Robert Henley, she was very much alive, in fact. I'd spoken with her just 2 days earlier about donating books to our grief support program. "Jennifer, I think there might be some confusion about..." I was in a car accident this morning on Highway 101, she interrupted. Head-on collision with a semi-truck at mile marker 23. I know this is short notice, but I'd like a simple service with cremation. My sister Linda will handle the details, but I wanted to make sure you knew I preferred cremation over burial. I checked with the State Highway Patrol and local hospitals. There had been no accidents on Highway 101 that morning, and Jennifer Walsh was safely at work at the library, helping patrons select their weekly reading materials. Jennifer Walsh died 4 days later in a car accident on Highway 101 at mile marker 23. Over the following weeks, I received 6 more calls from people arranging their own funeral services. Each caller provided specific details about their death time, location, circumstances that wouldn't occur until days later. Each caller requested particular arrangements that their families would later confirm were exactly what their loved one would have wanted. The conversations were always brief and matter-of-fact, as if the callers were simply providing routine information about upcoming appointments. They showed no distress about their deaths, no fear or sadness about leaving their families. They spoke with the calm efficiency of people handling necessary business arrangements. What disturbed me most was how natural these conversations felt while they were happening. The voices were unmistakably those of the living people I knew, not similar, but identical down to speech patterns, vocal inflections, and personal mannerisms. Only after the calls ended did the impossibility of what had occurred become clear. I started recording the conversations and cross-referencing the details with actual death reports. The accuracy was perfect in every case. Not only did these people die exactly when and how they described, but their families' subsequent requests for funeral arrangements matched precisely what had been discussed during the calls. The most unsettling call came 3 weeks into this pattern, from a voice I knew better than any other. Michael Harrison Funeral Services. This is Michael speaking. Hello, Michael. This is Michael Harrison. I need to arrange my funeral service. My own voice, speaking to me through the phone with calm professionalism. I passed away last night from a stroke while working late in the office. It happened around 11:45 p.m., right here at my desk, while I was reviewing the Henderson family arrangements. I'd like to be buried beside my parents in Greenwood Cemetery, and I think the simple oak casket would be most appropriate. Nothing elaborate, just a quiet service for family and close friends. I hung up immediately, my hands shaking so violently I could barely replace the receiver. I'd been working late the previous evening, and I had been reviewing the Henderson arrangements around 11:45. But I was very much alive, and the only stroke I'd experienced was the shock of hearing my own voice, planning my own funeral. I called my doctor and scheduled a complete physical examination, including cardiovascular and neurological assessments. The results showed perfect health, no signs of stroke risk, no underlying conditions that might cause sudden death. But I understood something now that I hadn't before. These calls weren't pranks or supernatural warnings. They were simply notifications, polite, professional courtesy calls from people who had already died but were taking a moment to ensure their final arrangements met their personal preferences. The fact that these deaths hadn't yet occurred in linear time was irrelevant to the callers. They were calling from the moment of their deaths, reaching back to arrange services that would honor their lives appropriately. I've stopped trying to prevent these deaths or warn the people involved. Robert Henley needed to die so that Martha could learn to live without him. Jennifer Walsh's accident allowed her sister to process grief in a way that brought their family closer together. Each death served a purpose that I couldn't see from my limited perspective among the living. The recording equipment in my office has captured dozens of these calls now, but when I try to play them back, the audio files are always empty, just the soft hiss of dead air where impossible conversations should be preserved. I keep detailed written notes instead, documenting each caller's requests and comparing them to the actual arrangements their families eventually make. The accuracy remains perfect, and the families always express gratitude that their loved ones' wishes were so clearly understood and honored. Last week, I received a call from my own voice again, providing updated information about my funeral arrangements. The details had changed: slight cremation instead of burial, a memorial service at the funeral home instead of graveside ceremonies. I wanted to let you know that my preferences have evolved, my voice explained calmly. I've had more time to think about what would be most meaningful for the people I'll leave behind. I've learned to accept these conversations as part of my professional responsibilities. The dead have always been my clients, but now they're also my colleagues, helping me understand what death really means and what the living need from those of us who serve as bridges between one existence and the next. Stone remembers everything, including futures that haven't been carved yet. I'm Sarah Chen, and I've been a monument carver for 15 years, specializing in the delicate art of engraving headstones and memorial markers. My workshop sits behind Millbrook Memorial Gardens, where I transform blocks of granite and marble into lasting tributes to lives well lived. It's solitary work that requires patience, precision, and respect for the weight of what each carved letter represents someone's final mark on the world, their last chance to speak to the living. The process begins when families contact me through the cemetery or funeral homes, requesting custom engravings for their loved ones' headstones. I meet with them to discuss fonts, layouts, and any special symbols or quotes they want included. Then I spend days carefully carving each letter by hand, using traditional chisels and pneumatic tools to create inscriptions that will endure for centuries. Every stroke must be perfect, because there are no second chances when working with stone. My workshop is equipped with industrial-grade security, not because the tools are particularly valuable, but because cemetery vandalism is unfortunately common. All my equipment chisels, pneumatic carvers, sanders, and polishing tools gets locked in steel cabinets each evening. The workshop itself is secured with deadbolts and an alarm system that connects directly to the police station. In 15 years, I've never had a break-in or any unauthorized access to my workspace. The headstones I complete are transported to their designated plots and installed by cemetery grounds crews. I typically don't see the finished monuments again unless families request additional engraving for spouses or family members. It's a clean, final process that allows me to move from one project to the next without dwelling on the sadness that each stone represents. That changed 6 weeks ago when I discovered that some of my completed work had been altered in ways that shouldn't have been possible. It started with the Morrison headstone, a simple gray granite marker I'd completed for Elizabeth Morrison, who'd passed away in August at age 73. The family had requested basic information: her name, birth and death dates, and the phrase beloved mother and grandmother. I'd finished the engraving 3 weeks earlier, and the stone had been installed in the cemetery's Garden of Remembrance section. I was walking through the cemetery during my lunch break when I noticed something wrong with Elizabeth Morrison's headstone. Below the inscription I'd carved, someone had added a second set of dates. David Morrison, loving husband, born 1949, died October 15, 2024. David Morrison was Elizabeth's widower. He was still alive, still grieving his wife's passing, still visiting her grave twice weekly to leave fresh flowers. What disturbed me wasn't just the unauthorized addition to the headstone, it was the quality of the work. The letters were carved in my exact style, using the same font and spacing I'd employed for Elizabeth's inscription. The depth and technique were identical to my own craftsmanship, as if I'd carved David's death date myself. I contacted the cemetery administration to report the vandalism, but the groundskeeper, Tom, was equally puzzled. "Nobody's been working on that stone since we installed it," he said, examining the headstone carefully. "And this isn't painted on or scratched. And this is proper stone carving. Professional work. Are you sure you didn't add this and forget about it?" I was certain I hadn't. The Morrison family had only purchased a single burial plot, and David Morrison was in perfect health. There was no reason to pre-carve his death information, and I would never add text to a completed headstone without explicit family authorization. But the carving was undeniably mine. I could recognize my work as clearly as my own handwriting, the subtle curves in the letter D, the particular spacing between words, even the slight imperfection in the number 9 that resulted from a tiny flaw in my favorite chisel. David Morrison died 5 days later of a sudden heart attack. The date, October 15th, 2024. 2 weeks after David Morrison's death, I found another unauthorized addition to my work. The Hendricks family monument, a large marble piece I'd completed in September for Patriarch William Hendricks, now included a new inscription: Margaret Hendricks, devoted wife, born 1951, died November 8, 2024. Margaret Hendricks was alive and well, actively planning her husband's memorial service and making arrangements to sell their family home. Like David Morrison's addition, the new carving was executed in my exact style, using techniques and tools that only I had access to. I began conducting nightly inspections of my workshop, checking every tool, every lock, every security measure. Nothing had been disturbed. The alarm system showed no unauthorized entries, and my tools remained exactly where I'd left them each evening. Yet someone was using my equipment and my techniques to carve death dates for people who were still alive. Margaret Hendricks died November 8th in a car accident on her way home from the grocery store. By this point, I was terrified to examine any of my recent work. Each headstone represented not just a completed project, but a potential prophecy carved in stone. I started avoiding the cemetery during my off hours, afraid of what I might discover among the monuments I'd created. But the pattern was impossible to ignore. 3 more times over the following month, I found my headstones altered with additional death dates. Each prediction proved accurate within days of my discovery. Each new carving was executed with my exact style and technique, using tools that only I could access. The most disturbing case involved the Walsh family monument, where I found the phrase, Emily Walsh, age 16, died December 3, 2024, carved beneath her grandparents' existing inscription. Emily Walsh was a healthy teenager with no known health problems, no risky behaviors, no apparent reason for her life to end. I considered calling Emily's family to warn them, but how could I explain that their daughter's death date had been mysteriously carved into her grandparents' headstone? How could I tell them that my own tools were somehow predicting their family's tragedy? Emily Walsh died December 3rd in a climbing accident at a local state park. She fell while attempting to retrieve a friend's hat from a rocky ledge, striking her head on stones below. After Emily's death, I installed security cameras in my workshop and positioned motion sensors around my tool storage areas. If someone was breaking in to use my equipment for these grim predictions, I was determined to catch them in the act. The cameras revealed something that shattered my understanding of what was possible. At 3:17 a.m. on a Tuesday evening, the motion sensors activated. The camera footage showed a figure entering my workshop, someone wearing my work clothes, moving with my familiar gait, using my keys to unlock the tool cabinets. But when the figure turned toward the camera, I saw my own face looking back at me. I watched myself select chisels and pneumatic tools, then begin working on a headstone I'd completed 2 weeks earlier for the Patterson family. The figure worked with my exact technique, carving additional text with practiced efficiency. Robert Patterson Jr., age 45, died January 14, 2025. The entire process took 47 minutes. When it was finished, the figure carefully cleaned and returned all tools to their proper storage locations, then left the workshop exactly as it had been found. But I'd been home in bed at 3:17 a.m., 8 miles away from the workshop, with no memory of visiting my workplace or carving any additional inscriptions. I reviewed the footage dozens of times, analyzing every detail of the figure's movements and appearance. It was unmistakably Menot, a resemblance, not a close match, but an exact duplicate down to the smallest mannerisms and physical characteristics. Robert Patterson Jr. was a successful attorney with a young family and no apparent health concerns, but according to the stone carving that my doppelganger had created, he had 11 days left to live. I couldn't bear to wait and see if this prediction would prove accurate like all the others. Instead, I drove to the cemetery in the middle of the night and used a grinding wheel to obliterate the unauthorized inscription. I worked carefully to remove every trace of the death date, while preserving the original family monument. Robert Patterson Jr. died January 14th in a house fire that started from a faulty space heater in his home office. Even destroying the carving hadn't prevented the prediction from coming true. The stone had somehow recorded a future death, and removing that record had no effect on the event itself. I've stopped checking my completed headstones for unauthorized additions. The security cameras continue to record my nighttime visits to the workshop, showing me carving death dates for people whose time hasn't yet come. But I no longer review the footage, and I no longer try to warn the families whose names appear in stone before their deaths. The tool cabinets remain locked each evening. The alarm system continues to function properly, and my workshop shows no signs of unauthorized entry. Yet somehow, I continue to carve predictions into monuments for the living, working with the precision and skill that I've developed over 15 years of professional stone carving. Stone remembers everything: the names of the dead, the dates of their passing, and apparently, the futures that haven't yet become history. My hands have learned to carve those futures even when my conscious mind is sleeping 8 miles away, ensuring that every prediction is recorded with the same care and permanence that I bring to my regular work. I understand now that some truths are too important to wait for death to make them official. The stone knows what's coming, and my hands have become the instrument through which that knowledge gets preserved for posterity, one accurate prediction at a time.